I'll go ahead and get us started. My name is Marietta Borjovic. I'm an assistant professor here at Yale in the Slavic department. I'm affiliated also with WGSS in Film and Media Studies. And it's my pleasure to be hosting this conversation today and introducing our speaker. Before I launch, I wanted to also say a few words of thanks to my co-conspirators in organizing this series, Emerging Voices in Reese, which has been really inspiring this year. I want to thank specifically Doug Rogers, Ginny Chu, Mina Magda, and Spencer Small, as well as Christina Andriotis and Kathleen Keefe, who are making everything happen behind the scenes, and the Macmillan more generally. This series is allowing us to stay connected and to hear about new ideas in a moment of otherwise isolation. So I'm deeply, deeply grateful for this. And today we have an exciting talk by Ruth Wurl, who is beginning a position as a lecturer in the department in Stanford's Department in Slavic Languages and Literatures. Is that right? Or you began it in this previous strange year. Ruth earned a PhD in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures, as well as a graduate dissertation fellowship at the Clayman Institute for Gender Research. Her work examines the role of the woman question in broader social and political and aesthetic debates in mid-19th century imperial Russia. And it is one such groundbreaking piece that she is presenting today, titled The Unmaking of a Man, the Life of Alexander Alexandrov and the Afterlives of Nadezhda Durova, Life in My Childhood Years. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you so much, Marietta. And thank you to Jenny Chu especially, and also Christina and Kathleen for making this all work. So I'm going to pull up my slideshow now. Give me one moment. Okay. Share. And I'll turn my video off during this. I apologize because I always change my titles at the last minute, but my current title for this talk today is The Unmaking of a Man, the Life of Alexander Alexandrov and the Afterlives of Nadezhda Durova. Nadezhda Durova is commonly portrayed as a curious figure, a woman who disguised herself as a man, joined the army, fought Napoleon, and was motivated to do so by an intense patriotic love of her homeland, or alternatively, as a means of escaping oppressive patriarchal norms in 19th century Russian society. These interpretations, which I term the nationalist and feminist readings, are constructed by ignoring the words of the author. Indeed, the two major myths about the author's life do not hold up to the slightest amount of critical scrutiny. Yes, Alexander was indeed born a girl named Nadezhda Durova, but he dressed like a man, spoke like a man, wrote like a man, and indeed identified as a man for the large majority of his years. Yes, Alexandrov-Durova served in the Russian military during the Napoleonic Wars, but his service was not motivated by a sudden swell of patriotism as a foreign invader threatened Russia's borders. He enrolled in 1806 during a brief window of peacetime, though he served heroically in the Prussian campaign of the War of the Fourth Coalition. He makes no mention of war or politics prior to the deployment. When he was recognized for heroism in combat by Tsar Alexander I, he had only two requests of the emperor. First, to be assigned to a Hussar regiment, and second, to be recognized as a male subject. Military service was its own reward. It did not represent an escape from femininity, but rather served as an affirmation of his masculine gender identity. Oh no, there we go. My talk here today seeks to challenge and reevaluate the dominant narratives about Nadezhda Durova, that she was a woman who merely disguised herself as a man, by instead focusing on how Alexandra's book was turned into something not of his own, something that directly contradicted his own words, thoughts, feelings, and intentions. Though my project is aligned with the intellectual and political goals of transgender studies, today I will focus less on philosophies of embodiment or theories of gender identity, and more on traditional methods of Slavic literary scholarship, namely providing some close readings of Alexandrov's text, an overview of the book's publication history, and critical reading of the introduction to the English translation. This is partially a reflection of the early stage of my research on this project, but I believe it also demonstrates that approaching him from a transmasculine perspective is supported by the author's own writing. As I will show, this presents a more complete understanding of the life of Alexander Alexandrov and the many afterlives of Nadezhda Durova. Relatively little is definitively known about Alexandrov, his life, and his writing process. Several key facts about his life, however, are known for certain and supported with documentary evidence. He was born Nadezhda Andreevna Durova in September 1783 to Andrei Vasilyevich Durov, a Hussar officer, and Nadezhda Ivanovna Durova. In 1805 or 1806, Durova adopted masculine dress, abandoned his parents' house, and joined the military under several masculine names, including Alexander Durov and Alexander Sokolov. He joined the Lithuanian Uhlans and participated in the Prussian campaign of the War of the Fourth Coalition. In recognition of his bravery, he was summoned to Petersburg by Tsar Alexander I, awarded the Cross of St. George, promoted to the rank of junior officer, and most importantly, granted a legally binding name change, becoming Alexander Alexandrov in honor of the Tsar. He retired from the military in 1816 and returned to Sozopol, his hometown, to take care of his aging father. Alexander remained there for most of his post-military life, aside from a few years in which he tried to make a literary career for himself in Petersburg. He died in 1866 at the age of 83 and was buried with full military honors. Though Alexandrov experienced brief moments of fame and public interest at various points in his life, this did not translate into sustained critical attention to the author. The first biography, an article, appeared in 1890. His book did not receive a second publishing until the 1910s, and although scholarly and creative works based on his life appeared during and after World War II, they primarily served as propaganda for the Soviet military. Likewise, the revival of the text in the 1980s, both in the Soviet Union and in the United States, sought to claim Durova as an example of a woman defying patriarchal oppression. While documentary evidence of Alexandrov's life provides little insights into his motivation, he's clear about this in his notes. He strongly desired to become a, quote, son to his father and Russian soldier, end quote. Subsequent works based on his life, however, largely dismiss this aspect of the text. Indeed, I argue that these works operate by recontextualizing Durova's transformation into Alexandrov, essentially detransing the text as a way of incorporating his experiences into various social or political discourses. In general, I'm very cautious to label historical figures with contemporary and culturally specific terms and identities, but I believe that the concepts of transgender and transmasculinity offer a productive and indeed the most appropriate critical framework for examination of Alexandrov and his writing. Transgender and related words such as transsexual emerged into the English language relatively recently, only becoming widely used in the 20th century. For today's talk, I take cue from historian Susan Stryker, who defines the term broadly, including, quote, oh, excuse me, before I do that quote, I just wanted to show you how wild the different covers for this book are and how they incorporate it into different ideologies. So I've very scientifically divided it into butch covers where we have very masculine representations, andro covers, which kind of blend the two, and possibly my favorite, but the least historically accurate here is a recent publishing in Russia that just totally thumbs it up, and it's aimed at young female readers. But excuse me, back to Stryker and her definition of transgender. So she writes, quote, it includes, quote, people who move away from their birth assigned gender because they feel strongly that they probably belong to another, through which it would be better for them to live. Others who want to strike out towards some new location. Those who simply need to challenge the conventional expectations bound up with gender that was imposed upon them, end quote. Indeed, Alexandrov spends the entirety of the introductory chapter of his notes outlining how he developed and expressed his identity as a male before leaving his parents' house for the military. Alexander begins his own story by situating himself within his parents' marital unhappiness. His father, Andrei Vasilyevich Durov, was a Hussar who met Nadezhda Ivanovna while stationed in Novorossiya. Nadezhda's father, a loyalist to the Zaporozhian Sich, which lost its political existence, strongly opposed his eldest daughter's romantic interest in a Russian military officer. After the couple eloped, Nadezhda Ivanovna's father disowned her. Though Nadezhda appears to have sincerely loved her husband, the emotional toll of being disowned and the difficulties of being a soldier's wife weighed heavily upon her. She found herself emotionally isolated and depressed. Durov, sensing his wife's unhappiness, distanced himself and began a series of affairs that would continue throughout their marriage. The author poses his birth as yet another event in the parade of catastrophes contributing to his mother's physical and emotional misery. After eloping, Nadezhda Ivanova tried desperately to reestablish ties with her father and family to no avail. Her mood improved after learning that she was pregnant, hoping that the birth of a healthy male heir would present an opportunity to mend her relationship with her family. In his narration of his birth, Alexandrov relays that his mother dreamed of having quote-unquote seductive daydreams, обольстительные мечты, about the birth of a son who would be handsome as a Cupid and naming him Modest. Alexandrov's birth quite literally ruins his mother's dreams and aspirations. She is severely traumatized by the birth process itself, suffering from prolonged labor to deliver the child and having a substantial amount of blood let during and after the delivery. More than the medical complications, though, Nadezhda Ivanova was most upset by the sex of her child, birthing, in the author's words, quote, not a son handsome as a Cupid, but a daughter, and a bagatir of a daughter at that, end quote. The bad blood between parent and child continues after Nadezhda Ivanovna recovers from the difficult labor. The ladies of the regiment, taking care of the mother and infant, encourage her to begin nursing as a way of building an emotional bond with the child. The newborn Alexandrov, however, refuses, quote, sensing the lack of maternal love in that nourishment, and therefore refusing every effort to nurse, end quote. When the infant grabs her breast painfully, Nadezhda Ivanovna passes him off to one of the regiment ladies, telling her to, quote, take her away, get that worthless child out of my sight, and never show her to me again, end quote. The situation escalates in a subsequent episode when Nadezhda Ivanovna, triggered by colic, throws her infant out of the window of a moving carriage. At first, it appears that Alexandrov may have died from the incident. The Hussars of the regiment race to take care of the bloodied and unresponsive infant. Miraculously, the child resuscitates in his father's arms, and though bloodied, is left without any permanent injuries or scars. The scene with the carriage serves two purposes in Alexandrov's narratives of gender identity. It outlines the genesis of the author's abusive relationship with his mother, which is a major motivating factor. But more importantly, it establishes men and masculinity as an alternative source of love, care, and belonging. The symbolic parallels between the birth and carriage scenes are readily apparent. His body is ejected from his mother's carriage, a metaphoric womb. There are images of blood and bleeding, and the infant is reborn among men. The Hussars and Durova take turns holding and carrying the infant, replacing the all-female collective in the earlier scene. The theme of masculine mother figures or mothering Hussars is developed further as Durov removes the infant from his wife's care, instead entrusting him to an older Hussar, his close aide, Astachov. It was not uncommon in the Russian military for officers to tap their male orderlies or subordinates for childcare throughout the pre-World War I period. It's actually utterly fascinating that this is such a widespread phenomenon. But Astachov goes far beyond the normal expectations of this sort of duty, especially considering that Nadezhda Ivanovna continued living with the regiment. Alexandrov explicitly poses his male caretaker as a surrogate mother, recalling how he clung tightly to him anytime he saw his mother, or even when he came near her empty room. Astachov showered the child with love and affection, albeit a distinctly masculine brand. He took Alexandrov riding, gave him a pistol and saber, and taught him about the fundamental drills of military life. Astachov's supervision lasted approximately 4 years. Alexandrov writes that they were the happiest days of his childhood. His happy masculine childhood ends, however, when his mother has another daughter and Durov decides to resign his military commission in favor of a civil service post. Durov obtained a post as the mayor of Stavropol, a recently chartered town south of Ijevsk. For Alexandrov, the most consequential aspect of this move was that he was then turned over to his mother's care, and writes that, quote, he never knew a calm or cheerful moment after returning from Astachov to his mother, unquote. Even though Nadezhda Ivanovna rejected her child on the basis of sex, she was distraught to see her daughter behaving like a son. He continued to behave like a little soldier, begging his mother to ride horses and allow him to shoot with toy guns and sticks. Though other relatives and domestic servants find the 5-year-old Alexandrov's behavior non-threatening and even charming, His mother saw it as a serious problem to be corrected. Nadezhda Ivanovna kept him on a short lease, forcing him to stay indoors, even though his sister was allowed to play outside, and to sew, knit, and weave lace all day. Alexandrov, however, was disinterested in and very poorly suited to the domestic arts. His mother flew into rages when he failed to produce satisfactory needlework and whipped him severely. The author writes that this proved that his mother, quote, disliked me wholeheartedly and confirmed my already invincible passion for freedom and military life, end quote. Only in one brief period does the young Alexandrov-Durova identify with his birth gender. After terrorizing his mother with his roughhousing and insatiable desire for being outdoors, Nadezhda Ivanovna sends her child to her family in Ukraine, and there he stays for several years. He finds peace there. He is able to ride horses and explore the countryside at will. He bristles at feminine life still finding it unappealing, though he has a brief normative female friendship with a cousin and a fleeting crush on a neighborhood boy. Recounting these events, Alexander muses that perhaps he could have made peace with women's lot if he'd stayed in Ukraine and married. The mother of the neighborhood boy, though, is unimpressed with the meager dowry, and Alexandrov quickly returns to his fantasies of male life. The brief moment of normalcy is interrupted then when he is summoned back to Sarapul after his parents have a major falling out over Durov's continued infidelity. Upon returning to Sarapul, Alexandrov's mother is totally distraught and like having every kind of stereotypical Freudian hysteria kind of reaction, just like total meltdowns all the time that are described in detail. And Alexandrov is tasked with soothing his mother, but nothing he does makes any difference. She heaps insults and pessimistic statements about the status of women upon her child, and really just like is mean to Alexandrov in 100 different ways. Durov, however, is still willing to indulge the young Alexandrov's masculine interests, taking him hunting, having a Cossack jacket sewn for him, and remarking several times that he was the living image of him in his youth. Then 16, Alexandrov continues to feel at odds with his gender. In part, he attributes his family issues to his biological sex, writing, quote, woe to me, the first cause of all my mother's troubles. My birth, my sex, my traits, my propensities, none of them were what my mother would have wished. My existence poisoned her life. Constant vexation ruined her already naturally hot-tempered disposition, end quote. He concludes that only transitioning and living as a man offers any solution, writing, quote, martial ardor flared in my soul with incredible force, and I began searching actively for means to realize my previous intention, to become a warrior and son to my father, and to part company forever from the sex whose sad lot and eternal dependence has begun to terrify me, end quote. So just to wrap up the section, shortly after coming to this conclusion, Alexandrov makes very concrete plans to enact his plan of becoming a male. He cuts his hair, puts on his Cossack uniform, prepares his horse Alcide on the eve of his name day party, and leaves his parents' home to catch up with a Cossack regiment that is passing through the province. Using a masculine name, Alexander Sokolov, he travels with them some 2,300 kilometers to Grodno at the far western edge of the Russian Empire, before he's allowed to enlist in the Lithuanian Uhlans, and that's where he begins his military career in earnest. So now that I've given you an overview of the first section, I want to talk about the influence of Pushkin specifically on producing the book that we know now and how this has changed our perception of it. So even though Alexandrov enjoyed a brief moment of public interest and celebrity following his audience with Tsar Alexander in 1807, he was largely forgotten when he retired from the service in 1816. During his retirement, he began editing and rewriting portions of his diary. It seems that he had no plans to publish his writings until his brother, Vasily Durov, who happened to meet Alexander Pushkin in the Caucasus. During their long ride back to Petersburg together, Durov regaled the poet with stories from Alexandrov's military career. 6 years later, in 1835, Pushkin began laying the groundwork for his journal Savremennik. He reached out to Durov to ask if his brother would be interested in selling his manuscript, writing, quote, I should think that their success can be vouched for. The author's fate is so curious, so well known, and so mysterious that the solution of the riddle cannot help but producing a powerful general impression, unquote. And here is one of the biggest problems of the text, so to speak, because the history of the book is quite murky. No partial or complete manuscript of the book exists to this day. It appears that one of the domestic servants actually gave the original parts that survived away. Though he was reluctant to publish his diaries, Alexandrov was encouraged by Pushkin's encouragement or praise and sent a manuscript in 1835. A serious miscommunication between the three players, however, caused the manuscript to be sent to Mikhailovskoye instead of Petersburg. Pushkin wrote to Alexandrov saying that it was lost for good. Alexandrov went into a deep despair upon receiving this news, as there was not another complete copy of the text. By a complete stroke of luck, one of Pushkin's servants recovered the second half of the manuscript, though the first was already destroyed. And the second half is what details Alexander's service in the War of 1812 to 1816, the war against Napoleon. Unfortunately, the first part was never found again. Not willing to take any further chances with the mail, Alexander brought his original diaries to Petersburg himself in the early summer of 1836. Despite the complications, Pushkin was impressed with the complete work and decided to publish the campaign of 1812 portion in his journal, and then subsequently published the entire manuscript as a separate volume. Things, however, did not go as well as Alexandrov hoped in Petersburg. He recorded his thoughts on his disappointing partnership with Pushkin and his underwhelming reception in society in a piece titled "A Year of My Life in Petersburg, or a Futile Third Visit." His objections to the trip primarily center around how others perceive his gender, and both in person and in writing. Even before he departs Sarapul, Alexandrov feels conflicted about the project, worrying that it may disrupt his ability to pass and be accepted as male in society. His brother Vasily attempts to sell him on the importance of the book, proposing that he would surely sell a book based on his own life if he, quote, put on a woman's dress in my youth, stayed in it for several years, lived in a circle of ladies, and was considered by all a real woman, unquote. His brother's comment, in which he likens Alexandrov's service and masculine presentation to a prank shawlist, did not sit well with the author and amplified his doubts on the true intentions of both his brother and Pushkin. Whereas Dura's comments failed to calm the author's anxiety, Pushkin's praise changed his mind a little bit. Alexandrov compares the feeling of receiving positive attention from the poet to the first moments of true freedom and enjoyment and euphoria in its masculine life when he leaves home and finally becomes a soldier. Once he arrives to the capital, it takes several days for Alexander to get situated before he meets Pushkin himself. Their first encounter, however, proves upsetting for the author. Although Alexandrov had been living as a male for over 30 years at this point, enjoying the recognition and acceptance of his military peers, the inhabitants of Sarapul, and for God's sake, the Tsar himself, Pushkin makes his acquaintance by treating him as female. And I'll put the block quote up here. Alexandrov writes, I will not repeat the praise which the genteel writer and poet then heaped upon the literariness of my notes, believing that he was speaking to me in the language educated people use to address ladies. He took my manuscript, and after finishing his obliging speech, kissed my hand. I hastily snatched, and here Alexander uses the feminine form, snatched my hand away, blushed, and said, I don't know in the least why. Oh my God, I got out of that habit long ago, using a male form here. Not even the shadow of an ironic smile appeared on Alexander Sergeyevich's face, but I dare say that he did not restrain himself, and as he related the circumstances of our first meeting to his family, undoubtedly laughed wholeheartedly over this exclamation. Pushkin does a number of these things throughout the visit that really upset Alexandrov. On the one hand, I like this passage because it demonstrates the way Alexandrov mixes gendered language in Russian to refer to multiple senses of self across time, contrasting his youthful feminine experiences with his adult masculine experiences. But it does not, as translators Mary Fleming Zirin and John Mercereau, and there have been a few other scholarly works. This passage, as they hypothesize, does not support their reading that Alexandrov identifies as a woman in man's clothing or as some sort of female-male imposter. Instead, his reaction to Pushkin's greeting is similar to his apprehension towards his brother's comments about disguising himself by wearing a dress. Both comments diminish Alexandrov's sincere self-identification as a man, embarrass him, and make him the butt of another's joke. And I want to be very clear that my purpose here today is not to hold Pushkin accountable to 21st century norms of trans etiquette or cancel him or whatever, but rather to reflect on how these interactions shape the publication of Alexandrov's book. English translator Mary Fleming contends that Pushkin saw the manuscript as, quote, needing no revision from him, but this characterization is certainly false for the complete notes that he intended to publish as a separate volume. Alexandrov reflects on the editing process throughout his account in My Third Visit. While he's encouraged by Pushkin's initial praise, he's worried that the copying, revision, and proofing processes take over several months to complete. In part, Alexandrov's worries stem from a complete unfamiliarity with the writing and publishing process itself. Though he appears to have had a natural inclination towards writing, Alexandrov never received any formal education and learned to read and write through reading books on his own. He had an uneven mastery of spelling, punctuation, and the finer points of literary stylization, issues that were compounded by the loss of the original manuscript and returning to working from the diaries themselves. So Pushkin just absolutely did change a lot to the text mechanically, and also inserted feminine verb forms where Alexandrov used masculine ones in this editing process. What truly upset the author, however, were the changes that Pushkin introduced to his text. The first major disagreement about content between author and editor arose in June 1836, and is preserved in part in a letter from Pushkin. In a prior letter, presumably sent sometime in May, Pushkin informed Alexandrov that he would be changing the title of his work for publication in Savremennik. Unfortunately, this original letter and the author's dismayed response have not survived Pushkin's existing response, which is the third message in this correspondence, shed some light onto the substance of that conflict, though. The author expected that this portion of his work would be published under his male name, Alexander Alexandrov. Pushkin, however, disagreed. He preferred to use the name Nadezhda Durova, dead naming Alexandrov essentially, in order to sensationalize the story as an account of a woman fighting like a man. Alexandrov, in his missing reply, and we can tell this from contextual information, appears to have offered a compromise title, The Notes of Alexander Alexandrov, The Memoirs of an Amazon. Though this compromise title would invariably out Alexandrov, the very thing he feared when his brother proposed the project originally, it was more in line with the author's self-image and willingness to explore his feminine past on his own terms. By the time Pushkin responded to Alexandrov's letter, however, it was too late to alter the typesetting, and he informed him that it would appear in the July edition of the journal as The Notes of Nadezhda Andreevna Durova, as published by Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin. And I have this picture from the journal. We can also talk more in the questions if you want about the epigraph. So in addition to changing the title of Alexandrov's work, Pushkin wrote an introduction. The foreword reinforced the poet's narrative of Alexandrov as a woman deceiving others by dressing like a man. And I'll show you the quote here from that. Pushkin writes, "What caused a young girl, possessing an honorable and noble surname, to leave her father's house, to renounce her sex, to assume the duties and responsibility that frighten even men, and to fight on the battlefields of the Napoleonic Wars? What motivated her? Secret family hardships, a feverish imagination, an inborn untamable inclination to heroism, love? These are the questions now forgotten that strongly occupied society upon first hearing of Durova. Now Nadezhda Durova has revealed her secret. Honored with her permission, we will publish her curious notes. With ineffable fascination, we read the confessions of such an unusual woman. We were amazed to see how her delicate fingers, which once gripped the bloody hilt of an Ulan saber, also wielded a quick, vivid, and fiery quill. Nadezhda Durova has allowed us to print these pages she wrote in 1812-13. It is with our deepest gratitude that we hasten to take advantage of her permission. So Pushkin's introduction lies to the reader in order to sensationalize his text, essentially. It's unclear to me when exactly Pushkin composed the introduction, if this was after he had the whole book where Alexandrov explains these questions on his own terms, but it seems very likely to me from contextual information that Pushkin wrote it after he had the whole thing. The inclusion of love in particular as a motivating factor is totally made up. Like Alexandrov makes nothing approaching this mention, and in fact transfers out of a regiment when one of the colonel's daughters is hitting on him. He was just very prudish in the text and seemingly in real life. But before I kind of move on to the next thing really quickly, I just want to show that Pushkin dramatically shaped the narrative of a woman joining the army as and kind of being a woman disguised as a man, not a woman who identified as a man. The publication of this book really alters the text substantially. And now, quickly, I know I'm running out of time and I apologize, but I want to talk a little bit about the English version, which is one of the more important works on Durova, Alexandrov, that's available. So Mary Fleming Zirin's translation of The Cavalry Maiden remains the most authoritative version of the text in the English-speaking world. Zirin was an important figure in introducing materials and concepts from feminist literary criticism to a wider audience within American Slavic studies. In addition to her own scholarship, she organized the Dictionary of Russian Women Writers, facilitated translations of several Russian women writers, and was instrumental in the development of the Association of Women in Slavic Studies. And the AWSS still gives out an award in her name. Zirin's translation, in my personal opinion, and I've taught it a couple times, is really good, actually. It's very readable and captures the enthusiastic tone and direct, very earnest style of Alexandrov's prose. But my issue with Zirin in the translation really concerns her framing of Alexandrov's life and work in the introduction to the English translation. Though she intended to correct the record by turning critical and scholarly attention to Nadezhda Durova as a neglected, understudied, and underappreciated voice in Russian literature, I argue that her introduction commits the same fundamental act of epistemic violence as Pushkin. She dead names Alexandrov throughout the introduction and discards his masculine identity almost entirely. Zirin uses Zirin uses feminine language throughout her piece and characterizes him as, quote, deceiving, concealing, or hiding his true sex from others, end quote. Likewise, she dismisses the author's anxiety about being published under his female name, despite the fact that he published under his male name throughout the rest of his writing career. And I want to show two quotes really quick here from the introduction that show how opposed she is to any sort of trans reading of Alexandrov. So Zirin writes, The Cavalry Maiden was the first major Russian autobiography to be published during the author's lifetime. Perhaps the fact that so many pages of the journal of this essentially private woman are devoted to depicting the life of Alexandrov, a somewhat distant male persona, made it possible for her to consider publication at all. We may deplore Durova's failures of candor, but we have to respect her courage in deciding to share as much of her remarkable life as she did with a Russian public not used to seeing authors exposing their private experiences to print. It's remarkable to me that she describes this whole project of dressing as a man, which continued far beyond his military service, as an issue of candor, right? This is a really serious charge in military government service language. And I'm not sure if she fully appreciated that tone of it or not, but it's consistent with this other passage that I'd like to read. So I'm going to start, it's actually not the first line, the second line in this. So Zirin writes, "It is clear from the cavalry maiden that she, meaning Alexandrov, continued to identify with her own sex. Durova differs from male military writers yet again, and noticing and sketching women of various classes and nationalities. Her attitudes towards the life hint at buried ambivalence. They range from broad tolerance and affectation for more conventional members of her sex to suppressed hostility and support for the patriarchal mores that she defies as a woman and subscribed to as an honorary male. Durova avoids suggesting that her rebellion should be considered in any way exemplary, but the mere fact that she portrays her adaptation to a military career with such joy speaks for itself. The cavalry maiden emphasized the benefits of her decision, the autonomy she gained, rather than the emotional dislocation she must have suffered in adopting a transsexual disguise." End quote. So Zirin and her interpretation, remarkably, are almost entirely inconsistent with the author's own narration of his transformation from an unhappy girl to a Hussar, a real man's man in the eyes of the Tsar himself. Her main point of astonishment that Alexandrov, this man who wrote a book about how fulfilling, exciting, and cool it is to become and live as a man, would not feel distress at adopting the transsexual disguise of male language and affect, reflects the underlying cognitive dissonance inherent in a project of reclaiming a transgender man for a narrow form of feminist politics. And what I'm working now on more is dissecting the kind of ideological and philosophical subtext of Zirin's writing. I think that Zirin may be paraphrasing ideas and arguments taken from Janice Raymond's The Transsexual Empire, which is kind of one of the texts of anti-trans activism. And Zirin really leans into this idea that comes from that transgender men are not really men, right? They're female subjects who are confused, and rather than expressing some sincere identification or affinity for masculinity, they are escaping patriarchy and escaping gender oppression as women. So much of this framing of Alexandrov or Durova's work, especially in the American Academy, comes from these two sources. And I really think they've limited our readings that are available to us if we don't go back and approach this work with new eyes. How am I on time? Am I over? I'm way over, right?
Take a few minutes, Ruth. Please finish.
I think those are my main comments that I want to end with. I apologize that this is maybe not a more developed project yet, but I think this work is, it's important to kind of understand that current ideas in gender and sexuality studies are not inappropriate for 19th century Russian material. And this is part of my larger work that I'm trying to do. This project came out of my dissertation, which talks about male writers who write from female perspectives as a way of understanding other experiences and trying to create a universalist or feminist politics. So with that, I'll just wrap up and we can go to questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. I'll jump in here and say something about the format of our discussion. Ruth, I'm not sure if you want to continue sharing this screen or if you want to go into a different mode, but whatever you prefer. So what I'll do is, as discussant, I'll say a few words about Ruth's presentation, ending with some more general questions, and then turning to questions from the audience. So if you do have questions, please send them our way via the Q&A button, and we'll pull them into the discussion towards the end. So first and foremost, Ruth, thank you so much for this presentation, this really intriguing and remarkable case study, and your very necessary reframing of it for us within contemporary gender and sexuality theory. And I'm struck by so many things about this story and about your retelling of it. One of the first things that I'm struck by is of course the literariness of the story, or even the literary clichédness of the story Pushkin wanted to tell, and that he pushed Alexandrov's story into being. The story that Pushkin tries to form, and the Vasily Durov participates in this as well, has of course a long literary and cultural history. The story that they want to tell is the story of a beautiful young girl who dresses up as a dashing young man to fight valiantly as a soldier, achieve greatness, but of course with also a lot of resulting erotic tension and intrigue, implicit or explicit. And for more contemporary versions of this cliche, we need look no further than Mulan, the Disney movie that is currently my child's personal favorite. And this is the story that Pushkin wants to push Alexandrov's memoirs into being, despite the protests of the author. Also, I'm struck by, imagining Pushkin's mind, struck, of course, by the kind of Shakespeareanness of the take that he's emphasizing. And of course, among Shakespeare's plays, let's see, counting the ones that come to mind, such a story of cross-dressing and resulting erotic intrigue. Okay, As You Like It, Merchant of Venice, of course, Twelfth Night, Merry Wives of Windsor, Cymbeline, and there might be others that I'm forgetting at the moment. So, this is the project, this is the literary casting, and the kind of literary legitimizing move that Pushkin thinks that he's bestowing. And your critique points to an aesthetic as well as an ethical failure of succumbing to the seduction of literary precedent and cliche, as opposed to wondering more at the highly specific nature of the story in front of him. So, resulting first question to you, Ruth, is more of your thoughts about the kind of irresistibility of this literary cliche for Pushkin. I also have a number of other stories, a number of other questions, such as the historical and legal precedent. Did Alexandrov's legal change of gender status serve as precedent in any regard? In Imperial Russia, what has its significance been? Does it hold significance, perhaps symbolic significance, for today's trans and queer communities in Russia? Perhaps not, perhaps yes. Then thinking about Zirin, and the various, again, kinds of readerly and critical failures you point out. The turf position, which I totally agree with you, is almost too kind of self-evident to warrant any further comment from me. It seems to me that Zirin falls into the easy fallacy of viewing victimization as one form of victimization or oppression, as exclusive to the other, as if the story of Alexandrov's experience negates the oppression and lack of possibilities open to women in the 19th century, and as if that is the only story that one can tell and must insist on. But what I think might be potentially going on there, and again, genuine question to you, that's maybe more interesting and maybe something that many of us are guilty of, is a kind of specific military aversion that then also colors and recolors the story. And again, I'll speak for myself and say that I have trouble reconciling a kind of, let's say, more Tolstoyan aversion to aestheticized violence, aestheticized state violence, with the reality that military service may well and clearly provides a fulfilling career choice for many, and that there are a complex series of stories to be told there as well. So I wonder if that's also coloring Zirin's narrative and pushing one particular story of familiar female oppression in reaction to the militaristic vision that may have been insisted on by other readers. And maybe I'll pause there and toss it to you.
Sure.
I have many more if we have time.
I will answer in order and try to blend, but yeah, you put it very well. Pushkin's trying to kind of fit a shoe on this foot very forcibly with using other kind of literary precedents and works. So one thing I would like to bring up that I cut actually, and let me share my screen again so you can all see this. So this title head, there's this epigram, right? Modo vir, modo femina. And this comes from Ovid when one of the king's daughters is telling the story of Hermaphroditus, which is fascinating. This line in particular actually doesn't refer to Hermaphroditus. It applies to this other king that has no other mention than Greek, Roman stuff. But this king apparently who could change their sex at will and like had a lot of fun with it. But this is another really, it's a really weird example that Pushkin chooses, right? And I'm trying to come up with a more convincing reading, but there's this Ovid dimension, there's Shakespeare, as you said. The Shakespeare element is actually really important for the Ryazanov film and other books written about Alexandrov, where the motivation is always that she disguises herself as a man to follow her boyfriend around, essentially, or crush, as she does cool war for Russia. So it's not just Pushkin. It's really like this elaborate mosaic of sources that are trying to shoehorn Alexandrov into this Amazon trope. And as far as historical precedents about the gender change goes, as far as I can tell, this is the one. It's, there was no formal legal process for this. And in fact, like, on the one hand, it's great that the Tsar can just wave his hand and it's reality. On the other hand, this was certainly not something that was accessible to most people who would want it. There are a handful of other so-called Amazon warriors from the 1812 campaign in particular. And one of them actually appears in Alexandrov's book. They don't meet, but Alexandrov sees her, and at this point, I think she was presenting as female. But so there are other precedents in kind of Russian military history of this period, right, that women, or however you want to call it, were presenting as male and fighting in the war. Alexandrov, as far as I know and have documentation of at this point, is the only one who continued doing it for their entire life. As far, I don't do a lot of contemporary Russian literature or cultural studies. I'm on the internet fairly often in trans spaces, but I haven't really seen too many people take up Alexandrov as a trans icon in those places. Certainly what the Tsar did doesn't have any legal bearing on what the process for trans recognition in Russia or former Soviet states is today. And I actually know somebody who changed their gender in Belarus. The formatting of it was, I think, the same as Russian. it was actually a lot more sensical in theory than what happens here in some ways, where there are many multiple different centers of power that you all have to make agree. There was just one judge, and there's some like, this is not my area of expertise, so maybe I shouldn't talk. There was some precedent that they could do it, but it was like functionally impossible. Yeah, and then finally on the Zirin war and turf stuff, I haven't really decided what Zirin's attitude towards military violence is. There's a history in writing about Alexandrov to diminish their role, his role in combat, to like really key in on all the parts where he complains, particularly in the first year of his service, that he feels too physically weak to walk in the military boots, or to do all the lance drills, or to do certain riding drills. And I have seen, I would say that Zirin is possibly zeroing in on those at a couple of points, out of this aversion to military, or like, I don't know, if like proto-toxic masculinity or something. Like Zirin clearly does associate this with a masculine position, and like poses military violence as a masculine thing. And I do think that maybe some of her diminishments of Alexandrov's ability to carry out those things speak to this kind of aversion that you talked about. The Soviet versions are the exact opposite, of course. The ones that are the film, you know, the Durova character like kicks a lot of ass, and does like all these cool, neat writing tricks and shooting, and like beats a person with a sword. Although she does get overpowered a couple of times, and then the male hero steps in to save her, and so does the orderly at one point. The book versions, I haven't read all of them, but they seem to be like pretty into the military violence thing and play it up.
I'll pull into our conversation here a question posed in Q&A from Natalia Plugman. Do you also consider as part of your work on Alexandrov-Durova the 1962 Soviet musical film Gusarskaya Ballada, the Hussar's Ballad, directed by Ryazanov, that portrays Durova? If you do, can you share your thoughts on it? Thank you.
Yeah,
so maybe we can take this as an opportunity for you to tell us a little bit more about that adaptation.
Yeah, I would love to. I wanted to talk about it actually just once I got the Pushkin materials last week that I've been waiting on and put in today. But the 1962 film is really interesting. And it's one of these works that uses the Shakespearean motif really heavily, the cross-dressing love affair kind of thing that you brought up earlier, Marietta. So the film is based on a play that was written in, I think immediately around World War II. I think it was first staged in 1941 or 1942, if I remember it correctly. Excuse me, let me pull up my note on that. Right, so it's Alexander Gladkov wrote the play in 1940, and it was first performed in 1941. That play is interesting because it's actually based in large part on Denis Davidov's military memoirs, as providing information and text. Durova as a personage kind of provides the main level of whatever historical precedent, but the film is so much different for a number of political reasons. So the war starts in 1812 and not any notion of Durova's service in 1806 or 1807. There's no mention of the Tsar for the obvious kind of Soviet anti-monarchy positions. And because like the political content of Alexander's book is so like unacceptable for Soviet film version, they have to focus on this kind of romantic angle. So the film begins with Shura, who's the Durova character, she's riding a horse in a little Hussar uniform, and the man who's engaged to her that they've never met arrives and takes her as a man in another Hussar, essentially. It's so gay. Like the entire first half of the film is Rzhevsky, the male Hussar fiance, expressing just like utter disgust at Shora's femininity when he, in the brief moment when he meets her in dress, like he talks about how boring women are and how they only want to like sew and talk about books, and what's like really needed is the company of men. So by the time that Shora's in the male army section, there's this like overwhelming homoerotic tension that's okay because it's not gay because you do it for Russia or whatever, but like it's this whole process of building homosexual tension in the military scenes, and then at the final battle when they defeat the French, she's outed and they can marry essentially, and they've proven themselves in love with one another. It's just it's a totally different work, and one that I am going to write more about. Does that answer? Sorry, I could probably say more if you need, but
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like maybe and correct me if I'm wrong, but that one maybe part of your project is looking at the reception history as well as adaptations of this story.
right. And it's so interesting because the adaptations rely so heavily on sexuality, whereas Alexander writes basically nothing about it. He writes that he's embarrassed when some women hit on him sometimes. Like that's a thing that happens a few points in the text. But I think, for practical reasons, he certainly would have been afraid to write that there was any sort of erotic dimension to it, because in that political context of the 1830s, right, it would not only be a violation of like social mores about sex and gender and like women wanting to have sex outside marriage, but it would be politically unacceptable too, right? Like you would be diminishing your effort for the homeland if you just wanted to like hook up with somebody in the army.
We are almost out of time, but I'm going to use our remaining few minutes to ask you, can you tell us a little bit more about how this project might fit into your other work? You mentioned other projects that seem really distant, perhaps in century or literary project from this one, but that are connected with questions of gender, gender appropriation in some of those cases of male authors writing from female voices. Can you tell us how these projects might connect?
Yeah, it started in large part. I was writing about Chernyshevsky and still am, and the way he depicts Vera Pavlovna's inner life and his kind of speculation about what the subjective female experience is like. I think Chernyshevsky does a better job than he gets credit for, actually. But I was constantly pressed on this, and then later I was kind of pressed, is this a trans studies thing that you're writing about, all these males writing from female perspective? And I thought really hard on that question and ultimately decided that no, it wasn't. But I'm interested in this very acute rise of needing to write about and from the perspectives of social others that comes up with naturalism, romanticism to an extent, but certainly by natural school and Russian realism. Alexandrov was the logical place to go with all this kind of proto-thought about trans theory that didn't apply to my first work. And the problem I see in the scholarship on Alexandrov really is that his very sincere identification with masculinity is not taken seriously, right? It's they pose his text in the same way that they should approach like Chernyshevsky or Druzhin's wife training novel, Paulinka Sachs. And they apply this whole critical framework of what it means to write another's perspective and apply that to Alexandrov. This is like so blatantly wrong. There's no serious engagement with what it means to write about the thing that you identify with. What Zirin does really well, though, and I will say I'm taking a lot from the introduction, is the conception of autobiographical text as it relates to war memoirs. And this is a series, one of the things I'm working on very early is reading Fyodor Glinka and Denis Davidov's military writings, and Tolstoy probably a little bit too, and showing how the male persona of the brave soldier is something that men have to live up to as well. Like, that there's this process of masculinization that all soldiers go through. And in some ways that we, I think, misconceive it for Alexandrov, right? Like there's an assumption that, I don't know, Glinka went into the army being a tough guy as though he's not this like frail little religious poet dude. And they reflect really seriously on the kind of process of being inducted into masculinity in the military, especially through violence, and how this violence builds a specific kind of masculinity that nobody has innate in them.
And that's fabulous and makes a great deal of sense to me. Of course, they're all performing masculinity. Of course, they're all putting on a disguise in that sense via uniform.
You have to.
Ruth, yeah, exactly. Ruth, we should let you go, but this is marvelously intriguing work, a really welcome and necessary intervention. And we are so grateful that you were able to join us and tell us a little bit about it. And we look forward to seeing more of it in print. So without further ado, please join me in a round of applause for Ruth. Virtual round of applause. Feel free, I'm sure, to reach out to her with more questions. We do have a recording of this event, so you can tell friends that if they missed it and would like to hear it, we can make that possible. And again, everybody, thank you for joining us on this here, actually very unseasonably beautiful Thursday. Over and out, and please join us next week when we have 2 more exciting speakers in the series. Ruth, do you have a last word?
I just want to thank everybody for coming and everybody who helped set up and everybody. This helps me an immense amount to kind of workshop these early works. So thank you again, everyone.
Thank you for your generosity. Bye, everyone. Over and out.